you. Dziękuję za pozwanie, I think. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I wholeheartedly want to extend a big thank you to the organizers of the conference. It's genuinely been so much effort and time to provide such an elaborate and very rich two-day conference. I'm really, really happy to be part of it. In light of time, I think I'll make sure to use it wisely and to rather inform you. Before I get to my slides, though, I would like to hear from you. How many of you, can you show me by a raise of hand, have attended a whistleblower training? If you have attended a whistleblower training, raise your hand. Okay, so not even 10% of the room. How many of you would say you have a general understanding of whistleblowing? Please raise your hand. Okay, that's more. Good. It helps me to sort of also see where we are and what's useful in terms of explanation. Well, Paul and I have a tendency to overlap, and it's great that he always goes first and I go second, because he always provides the sort of very solid legal background, and I tend to be a bit more colorful with the pictures and things, as you will see. But I do hope that there's a nice overlap in terms of elaborating the directive. The first point in my presentation that I would like to emphasize this morning is why do we even have this law? And we are so much focusing now on implementation, channels, this and that. But I would like us to all take a step back and remember what even initiated this discussion and really what is the heart of what it's trying to achieve. And then I will move on to focus on challenges and promises. And as you will see, 2/3 of my presentations are on challenges, which maybe in and of itself tells you something about where we are. So, one of the backgrounds to this discussion on a European level law for whistleblowers, because it is quite fascinating that we're today in this room and that we have this directive, because let me tell you, it is not self-evident. I was just out freshly of my PhD back in 2015 when we were trying to persuade the Commission to present a proposal. And at the time, we were having very big legal discussions on whether the European Union can have powers to do so, whether this is something that only member states can legislate. And soon after, what was sort of discussed, starting as a conversation from the European Parliament, from trade unions, from civil society, really was, I would say, accelerated due to the leaks that happened in Luxembourg. And this is an important aspect of why that tension is very important, because at the time, the president of the European Commission, President Juncker, was the former prime minister of Luxembourg, during more or less whose period the scandal of 340 companies benefiting from a variety of tax schemes that was revealed were actually took place. So in that sense, it's important to maybe also understand a bit the political pressure and nature in terms of the importance of what has taken place. Secondly, during the litigation and the judicial remedy sort of for the LuxLeaks, that provided a very good counterbalance in terms of saying what works and doesn't work with whistleblowing at the European level and with the rest of the member states, as I will show in a moment. However, that's only part of the puzzle. The other part of the puzzle are these two extraordinary journalists, one of which is a local from Slovakia, who were actually murdered as journalists for seeking the truth. I don't know if you need reminding that Daphne Galizia was a Maltese journalist whose car was set to explode in the middle of the day, 100 meters just from her house. And Jan Kuciak, unfortunately, was assassinated in the middle of the night together with his fiancée. And I do think there were legal proceedings and the murderers have faced consequences, although I do understand that there are some ambiguities left open still. This was a fundamental moment because this was outrageous that journalists are being murdered in Europe in this day and age for seeking accountability, for investigating corruption. And at that point, although the Council was not necessarily so politically motivated to act on whistleblowing, which, by the way, even as a word, whistleblowing, does not per se exist in many European languages. We had to invent it, including in the Netherlands, where I'm based, and sort of we call them now bell ringers, also positively, to sort of say these are the individuals who are ringing the bell. So the reason why I'm taking us back to this moment is to really say this is not just a legal piece on paper. This is not just sort of a question of irrelevance, some sort of reporting. This is really at the heart and core of democracy even, and what motivated the political push for getting us to a place of whistleblowers. So when the European Commission did indeed, after an extensive impact assessment, after consulting with the public, after receiving a lot of feedback in terms of what can be done, the Commission had considered 4 different scenarios in terms of what would be the best legal way for the European Union to legislate on this matter. So a lot of thinking did go through in terms of coming up with a final approach. It did say that protecting whistleblowers will help safeguard freedom of expression, media freedom, and it is essential to protect the rule of law and democracy in Europe. So I want to emphasize this because while now we talk about the technicalities of the directive, I do think it is important for all of us in this room to acknowledge that we are part of something that is at the heart of our societies and at the heart of healthy institutions and a healthy democracy. So how was the situation before? Indeed, as also Paul mentioned, there was a lot of gaps both in terms of the European Union, so EU legal acts that regulated in some way or another whistleblowing, and in terms of countries. As you can see, Slovakia actually was already, before the directive was proposed, you had just actually had acted on having a law, so you fall under countries that had dedicated rules at the time, but you can see there's not as much of purple as there is blue and sort of deep blue there. So the situation was not really great. So it meant if you are living in the EU, let's say you work in the same company, let's say you work in IKEA, and IKEA has offices in Sweden, Germany, and Slovakia, you'd have 3 very different situations depending on where you are, simply for the fact of being in one country or another. And that's what the whole point of the directive was trying to change. Although I think it is great in the Q&A if we can open the discussion in terms of how will that look like now in the future, considering what member states are doing to the directive. So what is the point actually, right? The Article 1, so the very purpose of this directive is to enhance the enforcement of union law and policies in specific areas. So this tool that is supposed to sort of help democracy for the Commission and sort of in the view of the Parliament, of course, it's to sort of see whistleblowers as a way of enhancing protection and enforcement of law. And the one thing that has always been a challenge is how do we continuously monitor and how do we continuously see all that's taking place across the European Union. Whistleblowers in this sense are the fantastic kind of monitoring capacity because they come forward with the kind of information that it's uniquely available to them and they're able to sort of bridge that information gap. It's what, for example, scholars call the cognitive power of feeding in institutions in terms of providing that information. And the table that you're seeing here was actually provided in an information sheet from the Commission itself in terms of how do we foresee the synergies between enforcement of what happens at the national level and what can happen at the European level, and how they potentially, through increased reporting, we can have a better overall assessment of compliance of European law. So let me move now that we've covered the first point in terms of saying, whistleblowing is extremely important for democracy. This is the reason why, and rule of law particularly, why the proposal exists, because law in itself was not enough. It was actually the rule of law motivation that made it possible, and that it is really trying to increase the capacity of the European Union to enforce European law across member states. Let me focus now on the second point, which is the challenges. There is a lot to say for the directive, and unfortunately, I only have 10 minutes left, but I will do my best to cover at least 3 main points, and that is challenges with regard to who is covered, challenges related to what is being covered and how that's being interpreted, and some procedural matters as a third point that will help us understand things a bit better. So, the very wording whistleblower, as I said, the word whistleblower even doesn't exist in many countries, and who falls in it and not. So one challenge that we're seeing in terms of what member states are doing is how is the word of worker being interpreted? I have to say there's a few elements in which the directive really sets golden standards, and the fact that it has a very wide scope of who it covers is one of those things that makes it a new era of legislating whistleblowing. But what the member states we're observing are doing mostly is actually not really abiding by this definition, or are trying, so whereas the directive is trying to say, to give you an example, I apply for a job, it's in a public institution, I go through the interview procedure. Through my interview procedure, I am having suspicion that some of this part of this procurement process is corrupt, and therefore I can report on this. If we are to apply the European directive properly, even if I don't end up getting hired, I can benefit from being protected. If we're looking at a lot of what member states are doing, it means I don't exist in the law. That's one of the clear examples where you're seeing member states actually not being very compliant in the substantive sense. So who is being covered is already a bit problematic. Then what the directive also says, it's supposed to be irrespective of whether they're union citizens or third country national, and it's irrespective of the nature of those activities and whether they are paid or not, okay? So it doesn't mean that if I'm an intern in a company that I shouldn't get protected. However, if we again fall under the more narrow definitions that some member states are going with, the fact that I would be maybe more of an intern, not paid, would actually mean that potentially I will not get covered. So this is a point in terms of being very vigilant, and I'm really looking forward to hear experiences of the countries that we have present in the room of how that's being tackled there. As Paul mentioned, one of the things that's really important in this directive is that not only the whistleblower themselves, but also parties in indirect retaliation would, by the directive, benefit: facilitators, colleagues, relatives, customers, recipient of services. This is also an element where it's unclear how this is manifesting in national law. So that is the part of who is covered, and we can see it at the very core of the directive. We're already encountering problems. In terms of what is being covered, it was really the hope of European institutions that they had done the utmost. This directive has 11 legal bases, which is a bit unprecedented in terms of trying to catch a lot of cherries from different trees and bring them together in one piece, and sort of saying environmental law, privacy law, aviation law, financial, all these different issues that are generally very different will fall under this directive. And it was hoped that member states will make it even more simple and just say any law, right? Because it shouldn't mean that some laws have, and how would you even as a whistleblower know, but I will get to explain that in a second. So this is another area where member states really, from Germany and onwards, are really taking a very narrow approach. And not only are they just sort of covering the kind of laws that the Commission has set forward, but even then we've sort of seen tendencies to try to narrow down fields. So the material scope has also sort of been trying to be trimmed down as well. The Commission understands that this is a dynamic reference. What does that mean? In the annex that Paul mentioned in terms of all the laws in the EU that they exist, that means that if we have a new European law that is in a different area within the policies, by definition, by the directive itself, that new law will be would be covered under whistleblowers. I will spend a second a bit on the breach because this is also very important. The directive does a very advanced in a way approach in saying acts or omission that are unlawful and relate to the union acts and fall within the policies, but mind the second sentence. And that it says, acts or omission that defeat the object or the purpose of the rules. What that second sentence gives us is an opening where it's not strictly speaking an unlawful per se, but that is defeating the purpose of the rule. So it gives even a broader opening. That too, and then the fact that it's potential breaches, attempts to conceal a breach, this too is an area, so that I don't dwell, but I just want you to kind of legally have that picture, is also where we're seeing a bit, let me call it stinginess by member states in terms of what's being at the national ground. Last but not least, it's important to point out that the Commission will review this legislation, and then there is scope for future expansion. So this does mean in a way that if member states are by default not doing it themselves, the story is not over. There is potentially a possibility for that extension to take place in the near future once the review in next year takes place. In light of time, I will skip the conditionality here, but I'm happy to explain it in terms of who can actually, how do we assess who can come under the European directive. I do want to say, though, because that is the most important thing to explain. If I'm a whistleblower, and I think that I'm reporting on something that is a breach of union law, right? I have no idea whether this is just covered by European rules or just national rules. If I didn't know, I will be covered. That the directive says the burden is not on the individual. And let me tell you, I am a European law professor. I actually teach the foundations of the European Union, internal market, etc. I wouldn't be able to tell you this is exactly where EU law starts and that's where national law finishes. Because EU law and national law are a bit like oil and water. They're very intertangled. So the burden is not on a random individual to know this distinction. And the motives generally don't matter. Happy to talk more about the channels, which actually I will do tomorrow, so I will skip this part, but I will discuss channels particularly in a panel tomorrow, so I'm happy, hopefully we'll be able to explain things there a bit more. Now I would like to focus on the promises. It's not all so grim, I suppose. But to just repeat my point in terms of what the challenges are, and I only enumerated a few, but already at the very heart of the directive, who is covered, what is covered, we are seeing challenges of that being properly, adequately implemented at the national level. The directive is a fantastic promise for member states. It really gives a fantastic tool in their hands in terms of what they can do. And here, I hope they will get the slides, I suppose, the participants, because I've enumerated, I'm sorry, this is not very eye-friendly to read, but I just wanted to give you as much of examples as possible in terms of all the different aspects where some level of discretion from member states is actually possible. And that is even for aspects that are very strictly set. For example, a timeline of 7 days of acknowledging a report or a timeline of 3 months, et cetera, there are aspects where there is discretion from the member states in terms of doing even better maybe than what the directive sort of sets out to do. I will focus here on just a few pointers that I think are more worthwhile emphasizing, because one thing that I, as a lawyer, know is sometimes the law is only as good as it can bite. The reason why when I teach GDPR and privacy, for example, why companies across were so interested in compliance, it was because the fines, the sanctions were very real. What we're seeing a bit with the whistleblower transposition in terms of the kind of penalties that emerge for companies, that's a bit still not as developed. So while as we have a complete prohibition to retaliate against whistleblowers on the one hand, on the other hand, it's not very clear how good it's to be assessed at the moment. Are member states doing a job to make sure that the companies and public institutions really take that seriously and not just another law on the books? The second thing that will be very important to sort of see is when we talk about anonymity, because that was one of the very, very difficult areas in negotiations around, do we afford full protection or not? And actually, it was sort of left that member states have more discretion there. And unfortunately, what we're seeing across the board is this tendency to be less accepting of anonymity as a means to report. However, if you're an organization is small, if you're a municipality that's small, if the likelihood of you being very easily pointed out is so high, anonymity is a way for both society to get that information and for that individual not to feel retaliation, because even if the law is there, there's too much pressure in a way, in a smaller, especially in a smaller context, to be pointed out that that's particularly who the whistleblower is. So there are aspects to the reporting channels as well, and the size of entities covered, and it's a few other pointers where there can be some scope. I leave these 10 points, and I hope you can get the slides and see them more, and happy to address more of these during the Q&A. Last point that I do want to make, and this is a screenshot. This is why this is sort of tiny as it is. This is from a news press from the Commission recently, that the European Commission has taken Czechia, Germany, Estonia, Spain, Italy, Luxembourg, Hungary, and Poland for failure to fully transpose and notify the national measures, which also sort of Paul mentioned. What I would like to say is this. On average, for all directives, not just this, there is a delay of implementation on time by at least 1 year. And also, let's not forget, and I see a few people with a mask, which remind me of COVID, that the whistleblower transposition time was during the COVID pandemic, where a lot of member states clearly had other very urgent priorities. What we see from the Commission is that it's taking this law extremely seriously, that even under the conditions of, on general, there's a delay with transposition, we have a global pandemic, okay, that's legitimate excuses, we're not accepting those. If you're not doing your homework with actually working on this law, we will take this seriously. And it is worthwhile to mention because there is generally a bit of leeway, I suppose, to some extent in terms of what's happening. But for the Commission, this is particularly serious. And it relates in a way with the rule of law, another regulation that's outside the scope of today's topic, but the conditionality regulation of making sure that the budget of the European Union is only given with the respect of the rule of law, where you have whistleblowing therein as well. So in that sense, we are seeing an emerging picture where the rule of law, whistleblowing are taken extremely seriously, and the Commission is not shying away from its role as the guardian of the treaties to actually use its tools and act on it. I've given a link with all the documents that you can possibly find, because there are many, and I find this very useful one for anyone who's more new to the topic. And on that note, thank you for your attention, and sorry for going overboard.